I've long thought that it was a shame that people were not able to attend their own funeral. and hear all the kind things that were said about them and the funny anecdotes and find out how others see them. After all, they usually only miss it by a few days. So I'm very grateful to Elizabeth, chair of our department, and to Ken, the dean of the faculty, for forking out a little extra money, more than was usual for this sort of event, so that friends, family, colleagues from across the university and from elsewhere could be invited. And I'm just delighted that so many of you are here, touched by the things that people have said, and grateful for the gift, which I think is very fitting. I think I would prefer the oak to the maple. And President Gilmore would be pleased. I have known every single president that McMaster University has ever had. And I interviewed George Gilmore when he was president of this university in his office across the hall over there in September of 1960, when I was the news editor of the Silhouette as an undergraduate student. And there was a complaint about there being not enough parking on campus. And he said that he did not want this campus turned into an asphalt campus. And his secretary was very proud of the fact that at the time we had not lost a single tree. So this is very much in the spirit of George Gilmore's vision for the campus, that there is going to be a tree erected in my honor. I want to thank particularly Elizabeth and Kim Squizzato, our administrative coordinator. Where are you, Kim? Back there. For all the work that they did in organizing this event. I know that it's a lot of work. This has actually been a week of reminiscences for me. Last Saturday, I attended in this very room a dinner of the reunion, a 50th anniversary reunion of the graduating class of 1964, of which I was a member. And on Tuesday, I was invited to address the last assembly of the students of the high school that I attended, Hill Park Secondary School, which opened in 1955 and closes at the end of this month after 59 years. I was asked to come to talk about what Hill Park was like in the 1950s, and also to read my valedictory address from November of 1959, which a teacher had found in the yearbook. And so I found myself speaking the same words 55 years later that I had spoken way back then, and they were indeed quite appropriate. So it is another occasion to reminisce. I don't want to mention people by name who are here or single out the different groups who are represented for fear that I would leave somebody out. I appreciate the presence of every single one of you, particularly Leo, whom I didn't even know the name of when he first came in and was wondering who this guy was, but all of you. But I should mention one person, because I would not be here without her, and that is my mother, Lucy Pickard. Put your hand up, Mom. My mother started her post secondary education at exactly the same time I did in September 1959. Growing up in England, she was not allowed to go on to post-secondary education. That was for boys, not for girls. She went to work, got married, had children, was a stay-at-home mom, and was left at the age of 32 as a widow with 4 children to raise, of whom I was the oldest at 10, with very few skills, minimal clerical skills. She went to work. She had always dreamed of being a teacher, and she inherited enough money that she was able to quit her job and go to the teachers' college across the campus, which at the time you could do straight from high school and get your teacher's certificate in 1 year and start teaching elementary school, which my mother did, and did in 3 different continents, including several stints in Africa, the first of which involved teaching in Kano in northern Nigeria, in the area where presently Boko Haram is kidnapping girls who are attending school and killing people. So I think we should say Boko Haram means Western education forbidden. I think we should say Boko Halal. Just because I mentioned that this is a kind of funeral service of myself that I'm attending, don't think that I'm expecting to kick off in the near future. I went to the website this morning of Ontario Public Health and entered my data in their life expectancy calculator, which I recommend to you as an exercise. And the answer was that my life expectancy is 92.9. It means that people with my profile can expect to live another 21 years. And I was told that my risk was physical inactivity. Now, I play squash occasionally with my daughter, but she's not available very often. And if anybody would like to play squash with me, who is not too good, please send me an email and I will be happy to have a game with you. When I spoke to Elizabeth about what this event would be like, I told her that I liked the tradition at some European universities that when a faculty member retires, they give a valedictory address, which is an academic address. And she kind of went a little bit white. I hope it's not going to be too long, she said. I've actually written it out, and it's 23 single-spaced pages with the title on rationality. And my friend Glenn Tenpenny, who unfortunately is not able to be here this afternoon because of a medical appointment, wrote to me to assure me that the second hour of a speech is better than the first. However, I am not in fact going to read it. What I have done is to upload it onto the McMaster Digital Commons, and if and when it's approved, you will be able to look at it if you wish. Just Google McMaster Digital Commons, enter Hitchcock as the author, look down the list of titles, and this one is called On Rationality. So this is a compendium of ideas about rationality that I acquired in my 46 years as a McMaster faculty member, either from other people or by my own investigations. And it is organized somewhat chronologically in terms of the development of my career and in terms of topics, starting with myth and rational argument in Plato, moral issues, where I talk about the course that I introduced with my colleague John Thomas, who is no longer with us, but whose wife Mo is here today, whom I'm very pleased to see. Going on to critical thinking, to informal logic, morality, argumentation and computation, logic and critical thinking in medicine, and finally, the existence of God. And in that paper, I make reference to the 6 philosophers and 6 scientists whose busts adorn the walls of this room. How many of you knew already that on the walls of this room were the busts of 6 philosophers and 6 scientists? Put your hand up. How many of you know the names of all 6 philosophers and scientists? Well, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to pick the bits of this address that link with those names and use my pointer here. So these are my slides, 12 of them. On the, does this work? Yes, it does. So over here on the east wall are the 6 philosophers in chronological order from the oldest, and over here the 6 scientists in chronological order. I started my career still writing my dissertation, which was on myth and rational argument in the dialogues of Plato, who's depicted right there. What perplexed me was why he had his main character, Socrates, who is right here, and other spokespeople for his views, not only engage in rational argument about important basic questions, but also to launch into the telling of fanciful stories, which were confessedly fictional, possible ways that things might go, about things like the immortality, the fate of the soul after death, the way God created the world, the lost island of Atlantis, the lost city of Atlantis, and so on. And at the time, it was a common view in the scholarship that for Plato, dialectic, the rational discussion, the back and forth question and answer with argument, only took you so far, and at a certain point, the character would have to tell a story to communicate some higher truth. And this was the view in particular in the only book-length study of Plato's myths at the time by a neo-Kantian named J.A. Stewart, who wanted to interpret Plato according to the ideas of Immanuel Kant. And he is, let me work my way along, he is the last guy right up there in the choir stall. Kant, in his critique of pure reason, had argued that reason got into contradictions when it tried to think about things beyond the realm of possible experience, like the immortality of the soul and whether the world had an origin of time. He thought that general principles like the principle that every event has a cause, or that the phenomena we observe are the characteristics of substances that have a relatively permanent existence in time, were not objective principles in a transcendent reality, but were organizing principles to create a unified experience that were imposed by the mind. He called this his Copernican revolution, naming it after Copernicus, right here, who wrote a book in the 16th century propounding the idea that it wasn't the case that the sun revolved around the earth, but that the earth revolved around the sun. And in the same way, Kant said it isn't that the mind finds the real principles, that the real principles come from the mind. So Stewart was imposing this kind of way of thinking on Plato's dialogues, and there had some plausibility in that they did talk about things like the myths did talk about things like the immortality of the soul and the beginning of the world in time that Kant declared to be beyond the reach of pure reason. However, in Plato's dialogues, there are actually arguments that the soul is immortal and arguments that the world has a beginning in time. It doesn't look like Plato thought these things were beyond the reach of reason. So what I was able to do in my thesis was to develop some criteria for extracting from a Platonic myth the message that was being communicated by the myth, and to show that in general what it was the same message that had been argued for, and that the function of the myth was to kind of reinforce this idea by showing how it could apply in areas that were beyond our immediate experience. The next section of my address talks about moral issues, this course that John and I developed together and that eventually became a course in bioethics, in which John and I collaborated as fellow members of the Clinical Ethics Committee of the McMaster Hospital, and prior to that, attending in the same summer a workshop on bioethics at the Hastings Center in New York State. So thinking about this fruitful collaboration with John and the friendship that emerged along with our interaction academically, I noticed that at the recent occasion when Michael DeGroot gave another $50 million to the McMaster medical program, MD program, the graduates of the program were taking their Hippocratic Oath, which is named after Hippocrates, the father of medicine. I wrote to John Kelton, the dean, to find out which version of the oath they took, because they sure didn't take the one that Hippocrates wrote, I'll tell you that. I thought I would get an answer from an assistant who said they were referring it on to somebody. John himself wrote right back, and he said, I've tried to find out what the original oath was like. I've never been able to do so. And I said, well, I can give you a literal translation if you're interested. It would be good practice for my Greek. He said, oh, I'd like that, and can I pass it on? So this is a project for July. I put in my book to do a literal translation of the Hippocratic Oath. My academic life and my research is not going to end after June the 30th. Another part of my address concerns informal logic, about which Nick spoke, which I got into after attending a career-changing conference in 1978, which Nick also attended, in fact. What I found there was a newly self-conscious subfield of philosophy, which is devoted to the study of reasoning and argument as they occur in natural languages, and in which there was a set of research questions that were not the same as the questions in the formal logic in which I had been trained. And I took as my own question the so-called problem of missing premises. So the idea was that when people argue, they don't state all the premises from which they draw their conclusion. They leave some out. And this idea goes back to Aristotle, who is here, and who said in his rhetoric that public speakers often use arguments that have fewer premises than the primary syllogisms because the audience can supply what is omitted. And this explanation is still given in textbooks and scholarly works that are published today. So the problem was, I'll give you an example. Somebody might argue that Kelvin, who is Kelvin? 1, 2, 3, he's right at the end. Lord Kelvin, born as William Thomson, was a great scientist. Now, why is he up here? Now, by the way, I got curious as to on what criteria these 12 were picked and who did the picking and what the debate was. I spent an afternoon in the archives of the Canadian Baptist Archives in the basement of the Divinity College, looking through all the documents involved in the move of McMaster to Hamilton and the building of all of this stuff. I read the minutes of the Planning and Building Committee of the Board of Governors, on which I later sat. Not a word, not a word. So one can speculate why these people were chosen, and somebody might have argued Kelvin was a great scientist because he discovered the value of absolute zero. So that's not a formally valid argument. And the question is, what is the unstated premise that is somehow there that you would supply if you were reconstructing this argument? And there were criteria developed, had to make the thing formally valid. You couldn't make a stated premise redundant. It had to be just filling the gap. But the problem is there are infinitely many ways of meeting those criteria. The minimum is just to put, if Kelvin discovered the value of absolute zero, then he was a great scientist. But this just reiterates what you say when you use the word so. What you want to know is, how does it follow from the fact that he discovered the value of absolute zero that he was a great scientist? And you might say, well, anybody who discovers the value of absolute zero is a great scientist, or you might say anybody who discovers the value of a fundamental physical constant is a great scientist, and absolute zero is a fundamental physical constant. But there are lots of options. Well, I became aware of a minority tradition which held that in such arguments there were no gaps. Like the emperor's clothes in the story of Hans Christian Andersen, the missing premise was not there. In fact, it wasn't there when I told you the argument. There was just one premise, that he discovered the value of absolute zero. The reason people thought that there was a missing premise was because they thought that an argument, to be complete, had to be formally valid. And in this tradition, to which I have contributed, there is a broader conception of validity, according to which arguments can be materially valid as well as formally valid. In other words, they follow according to a rule of inference that has some content. For example, from X discovered the value of a fundamental physical constant, you may conclude that X was a great scientist. And that's a sound rule if it will always take you from a true premise to a true conclusion. I'm not sure that it actually is sound, but I was relieved to discover that Kelvin had done other things in science besides discover the value of absolute zero. Another topic in my written reflections on rationality is logic and critical thinking in medicine, which I became involved in by being invited to be the second author, co-author of a book on this topic, which got published with that subtitle by American Medical Association Press. I just deposited a check today with some royalties from the sales. And I've collaborated with my co-author, Milos Janicek, from Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics on subsequent articles. And we have collaborated with a guy from Dalhousie called Pat Croskery, who is an academic physician working in emergency medicine, in an effort to get critical thinking made part of the medical school curriculum. Croskery is particularly concerned about cognitive biases, of which cognitive psychologists have made us aware. In particular, confirmation bias, which leads us, if we have some hypothesis in mind, to look for and notice the evidence that supports the hypothesis, and to ignore and not look for the evidence that counts against it. There are actually studies, both empirical psychological studies and historical textual studies, that reach the same conclusion, that the most common error of reasoning that people make is to fasten prematurely on a conclusion and ignore evidence that comes along that counts against it. So he's interested, Croskery, in what he calls cognitive debiasing. How do you become aware of the fact that these cognitive biases are affecting the way you think, and how do you overcome them? Because in the context of emergency medicine and of general practice, where physicians are dealing with a huge variety of symptoms and signs that people present with, they often make mistakes in diagnosis, estimates about 1 in 6, and that should be lower. Well, this cognitive debiasing tradition actually has a history. You can trace it back to Francis Bacon, who is right here, who was Lord Chancellor of England. Some people think he actually wrote Shakespeare's plays, but he also was a proponent of empirical natural science and a very visionary advocate of the usefulness of empirical natural science in improving the lot of humanity. So the idea using the results of science for technological improvement is something that Bacon contributed, and that was not a traditional idea. Science was typically understood to be just simply the way of understanding the way things worked and not of any particular practical usefulness. Well, in his writings, Bacon said that the human mind was not a blank slate on which experience could write the things that it encountered. It had biases. It was prone to false beliefs, and these had to be gotten rid of. And he distinguished them as the idols of the tribe, the idols of the cave, the idols of the marketplace, and the idols of the theater. In the paper, I talk about what these idols are and give some contemporary examples. In the interest of time, which is actually going a little too long, but I'm almost finished, I won't mention them now. I'll mention, finally, the issue of the existence of God, which I talked about in 2004 in a proemial lecture delivered to the joint doctoral program about which Ken Dorder spoke. And in that lecture, I spent half the time clarifying the question and the other half the time actually answering it. And you can read the answer in the written version. I'm not going to go through any of the content, but it provides me an occasion to mention the sixth and last philosopher whom I haven't pointed out. This one back here, who is Spinoza, a Dutch Jew who identified God with nature. So he, in his writings, refers to Deus sive natura, God or nature. So one of the options or the conceptions of God that I deal with in this paper is the conception of the universe as a whole, physical universe as a whole, in one of its dimensions being divine, a kind of pantheism. I've got 10 of the 12. The last two I couldn't work in. There's one more I can work in, and then I have two left. So one of the arguments that people give for the existence of God is that the purposiveness that we see in the way that living organisms are structured and their behavior tendencies points to an intelligent designer. And in my paper, I make the point, which I think is fairly obvious, that this is a much weaker argument than it used to be because of the theory of evolution that was developed following Darwin, and he is here, Darwin. I expressed some surprise to Chuck Johnston from the history department, who wrote the first 2 volumes of the history of McMaster, at the fact that a Baptist institution would choose to put Darwin as one of the great scientists in the hall of their university. And he said, no, there was no difficulty with the Baptists in Ontario and Quebec at that time with accepting the theory of evolution and accepting Darwin. But what Darwin showed is that the purposiveness that we see can be explained as the result of natural selection, of what he called descent with modifications. And so it actually put the attribution of purposiveness to organs on a scientific footing. You could prove scientifically that this was the purpose of the thing if you could show that that was what it had been selected for in its evolutionary history. Okay, so now I do have to just throw in like a deus ex machina. The last two people who are here that I couldn't tie to work that I myself had done. So let's see. This is Hippocrates, this is Copernicus, this is Isaac Newton, who definitely deserves to be among the greats of science for his work on the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And this is Michael Faraday, about whom I didn't know very much. I remember my brother Adam, who's a distinguished Canada Research Chair holder, a professor of chemistry at this university, telling me that he kind of works like Faraday used to work. Well, I found out that he was a great experimentalist, and he did all sorts of different things, and particularly he did a lot of work on electromagnetism. So I'm now happy to accept that he deserves his place here, although for myself, I probably would have wanted Galileo to be one of the six. Well, I thank you so much for your attentiveness and for your presence and for the love I felt and the kind remarks. Please stay, please chat, eat the rest of the food, have another drink, and I'm not going away. I will be coming back now and again to talks with the philosophy department, and I hope to see all of you in one context or another at one time or another. Thank you.
Thank you, David, ever the educator. I don't think we'll ever see this room in quite the same way again. I do want to mention that David found, as he was clearing out his office, many copies of the abstract of his doctoral dissertation, which he has brought here and made available to anyone who'd like one. I think this shows we all live in hope that someone cares about our doctoral dissertation. Let me just remind you, too, if you haven't already signed the guest book, please do so. And thank you for coming. And as David said, please enjoy the food and drink. Thank you.